Alrighty, publications and sources of information. Now, that doesn't strike a lot of interest in the brains of a lot of students. However, I will say that if you master the things we're going to talk about in this short lesson, you'll be able to answer any question you have about aviation. And that's a pretty cool tool to be able to have in your toolbox there, is being able to say, well, what can I do? Can I take an iPad instead of a chart? Like, how do I find that out? Or what does it take to get that instrument rating after I get my private pilot's license? Or my CFI says it's going to take me 60 hours to get my license. Like what's he basing that on? You can answer your own questions by understanding these sources of information. And there's tons of them. I mean, it is library, kind of large libraries of books on just aviation, and learning how to curate and those things and all that can do it. You can also use Google, of course. You can always go Google your question, but then you're at the mercy of somebody on the other end. And at the end of the day, the FAA does not view Google or the internet in general as an official source of record, official source documents that they want you to go off of. So these are all about source documents from the FAA and how to use those, because that is the best source of information for legal answers to questions of things of privileges and limitations of all pilots and aircraft. So let's get to it. Make sure you got your packets ready for your notes, and away we go. This is on publications and sources of information. So here's some things I should have memorized but don't. Number one, how long does an ELT battery last before it must be swapped out? What are the cloud clearance requirements for Class G airspace? I should have that memorized as a pilot and flight instructor. What are all the signs at the airport? Like, what do they all mean? I should probably have those memorized. And what causes precipitation static? I should probably know that. I feel like I've been flying so long, I should know what precipitation static is and what causes it. Well, guess what? I don't know these things. I include what maintenance can I do legally on my airplane. I know some of it, of all of this. I know some of these answers, but sometimes they're not super clear in my brain. And guess what? I don't need to memorize every single thing. Now, these are, of course, examples that I may or may not know right now, but these are things that I always just like to look up. Like, what's the difference between an accident and an incident? I kind of remember most of the stuff for an accident. I know it has to do with like a serious injury and a dollar amount and props flying off planes and all kinds of stuff. But if I really needed to know, I would look it up, because a good pilot is resourceful. If I really needed to know the answer, I would pause and go look it up. I would need to have sources I could use, and I need to be able to be resourceful and use those. That is one thing I've said to students for the last 15 years plus, instructing them, is teach yourself to be resourceful, teach yourself to be reliant, and have your own tools that you can use at any time, whether you're in the airplane or out. Because if you're resourceful, meaning you can go out and find information on your own or figure things out on your own, you'll have a nice long flying career. And so, what resources can we use to ensure safe and efficient flight? That's right there in the FARs, that we're supposed to have safe and efficient flight of aircraft. So we're going to talk a lot about FAA publications, things like the FAR AIM, like ADs, airworthiness directives, NOTAMs, notices to airmen, advisory circulars, and those types of things. And there's two types of information we're going to talk about. Number one's regulatory information, and there's non-regulatory information. And regulatory sources refer to information that is legally binding and enforces compliance with established rules, regulations, and standards. And for examples, the Federal Aviation Regulations, well, regulatory, it says regulations right in it, but also some things called FADs, NOTAMs, whether they're FTCs or TFRs. And if you don't know what those are, we're going to talk about those in this lesson. So just write those down. And non-regulatory, these provide information and guidance that is not legally binding, saying this is how we suggest you do it. Most people will do it this way because we're also suggesting it to all pilots to do it this way. So most pilots are doing it this way. This is a safe way to do it. This is the way we recommend it, or whatever. And they help give out knowledge in form of textbooks and flyers and all kinds of different things, best practices, recommendations, and all that. Disseminate, by the way, is a big word that means to give out, like hand out. And examples are ACs and the AIM, so advisory circulars and the Aeronautical Information Manual. We're going to talk about what all these mean right now. Here we go. So first, let's talk about the FAR AIM. The FAR AIM. And the FAR AIM is two books. The FAR is the Federal Aviation Regulations, and these are from the Code of Federal Regulations, or the CFR. And these are from the federal or the national government. The AIM is the Aeronautical Information Manual. It explains how the National Airspace Works system works, the NOS, including airspace, radios, airports, medical facts, safety, all kinds of stuff. It's non-regulatory, the AIM. FAR's regulatory. AIM, non-regulatory. So how is the FARs organized? So let's start with the FARs first, the Federal Aviation Regulations. For example, 14 CFR 661.3. If you wanted to see what that looks like, it looks like this right here, okay? Issuing of airman certificates, ratings, and authorizations. And there's all this stuff in here that when you're a flight instructor, you should read, but you should also read once you get your own private pilot's license, because this talks about how we apply for things or how we legally do things. Like, why do I have to fill out this form? Why can't I just show up to my test without it? Those kinds of things. And so we're going to talk about how this is organized, And so, so first, let's start with the first part, 14 CFR. This is the 14th chapter or whatever title in the Code of Federal Regulations. All the laws we study in this class are in 14 CFR. We won't study anything that's not in 14 CFR. 61, this is the part of 14 CFR where the regulation is. It's like a chapter in a book. And point 13 or 0.13, this is the regulation number in that part. Okay? So this is the 13th regulation in part 61. Now, typically, when we talk about regs in class, we'll just say 6113. I won't say 14 CFR because all the ones we're going to talk about are in 14 CFR. So just keep in mind that that's not a decimal. It just counts up. So after 0.13 will be 0.14, and after 0.99 will be 0.100, okay? So it's not like a decimal number. It counts up. It's 0.1, 0.3, 0.4, but then it goes to, when it hits 0.9, it goes to 0.10. Because if it was a decimal and we hit 0.9, we'd roll over to 62, but we're not going to do that. So, all right. So, parts you should be familiar with. Part 61, Part 91, Part 121, Part 135, and Part 67. So here we go. Part 61, certification of pilots, is how you get your licenses and certifications. Part 91, general operating and flight rules. Now, this is kind of like the rules of the road. So like when you had to study all those rules to get your driver's license or whatever, this is kind of like that. And it's what rules do I have to follow while flying in general aviation, or what we call GA, general aviation, or what we call GA. Then we have certificated air carriers. This is the airlines. So if you're doing rules that, if you want to look at what rules the airlines have to follow, it's Part 121. They don't follow Part 91 in most cases. They follow Part 121 if they're an airline and they have a certain certificate they get from the FAA so they can operate scheduled flights and all this kind of stuff. It gets really kind of messy. We won't worry about that too much, but you should be familiar with it. 135, that's commuter and on-demand operations. These are like charter or air ambulance or aircraft for hire with less than 30 seats. Those are Part 135. So if you're trying to get paid and you're going to buy like a 10-seat like twin-engine plane and you're going to fly people around the U.S., you would need a Part 135 charter license or certificate. And we have this thing called Part 67. This is medical standards. So if you're like, I have an eye problem or I have some sort of condition, like I maybe have diabetes or a heart condition or whatever, can I still get my medical? You could look at Part 67 and try to figure out from there. But that's how you get a medical certificate to fly. We'll talk more about this in a later lesson. If we haven't already talked about it, maybe we already talked about it a little bit. So you want to learn to read the regs. So this uses a trick called abstraction. Basically, abstraction is like many times, abstraction is when you look at something that's kind of got a lot of words in it, like in a paragraph, but then you just pull out the most important parts. That's what abstraction is when you pull out the most important parts out of some sort of document, or you watch a movie and somebody asks you to summarize something. You're using usually abstraction to do that. So we're going to do this in class. We're going to use and look these up. You can go ahead and look them up ahead of time if you want to, but we'll be put in groups and we'll look these up. And we're going to use some abstraction to figure out what they mean. All right, next up is the AIM. The AIM is the Aeronautical Information Manual. The AIM is divided into chapters. Okay, the AIM is divided into chapters. It's not like the FARs. And here's all the different chapters there. We have chapters 1 through 11, then we have appendixes for that as well. And there's all kinds of different stuff. If I had the internet, we could click on that and look at that. We'll just look at that in class. Many aviation textbooks get their information from the AIM, but you can download it for free or buy a paper copy. And the information in there is non-regulatory. It describes how the National Airspace System was intended to be used and gives safety information. I skipped that one, sorry. All right, so we'll do these in class. And next up, we're going to talk about NOTAMs. NOTAMs, or Notice to Air Mission, is a notice containing information concerning the establishment, condition, or change in any aeronautical facility, service, procedure, or hazard, the timely knowledge of which is essential to personnel concerned with the flight operation. They're considered regulatory. You're supposed to follow these when they're about a chart change, that is, or an FTC NOTAM. They used to be called notices to airmen recently. So if you hear pilots talk about notices to airmen, they're really talking about notices to air missions. So there we go. So NOTAMs are issued by national authorities for a number of reasons, such as hazards such as air shows, parachute jumps, glider, flights by important people such as heads of state. So like when the president visits, we may get a NOTAM. Closed runways, so maybe they're going to pave a runway at an airport, so they'll say notice to air mission, runway 35 at Salt Lake International is closed. So that way you know, because you're planning on using that runway. It'd be good to know that, because some airports only have one runway, so sometimes they'll close them and it won't be on it, just still be on your chart and everything, but you're required to know those NOTAMs before you go fly. Unserviceable radio navigational aids, so maybe you're going to use something called a VOR or an NDB. That would be you'd want to know if they weren't going to work, because if you're planning on using them and you're out there flying in the desert at night and that radio aid's not able to be used, you'd want to know that. Military exercises. Tall obstructions without lights. Recently, there was a flagpole erected near the Tooele Valley Airport, and they had to put a NOTAM out because it was not lit. So if you're flying along, it was right near the approach path to runway 35. So if you're flying in there at night, you may not know it's there. And if you're a little low, you could scrape that flagpole and do some damage to your plane or to something on the ground. Temporary obstacles near airfields, kind of the same thing. So this is what a NOTAM might look like. So like you might look at this and say, I don't know what that means. But look, there's words in here, like tower. Okay, so a tower, obstacle tower. Okay, 269.7 feet. Oh, okay. US 23071. What in the world does that mean? Well, that is how we write dates and times in NOTAMs. US means unserviceable. It's not. It's going to be unusable, or this is the service period, and this is the duration of the NOTAM when it's active. This is the active part. So how do I read this thing to make some sense out of it? Well, that's the year it's active. So this is when it starts, and then after the hyphen is when it ends. So this is the year it's active. So 2023, the 7th month of 2023 on the 17th day at 22:06 local. So this would be at like 10. You got to learn to read that 24-hour clock. So this would be like 10:06 at night. Until this is when the NOTAM expires. It's when it's canceled, 23rd year, 12th month, 2nd day of the month at 23:59 local. So that's 11:59 p.m. So when it rolls over to the midnight and it changes to the 13th day, this NOTAM will no longer be there. So we'll talk about some of those in class as well. We're going to look up NOTAMs in class as well. So then we get to ACs, advisory circulars. This is one that I use a lot. I use advisory circulars in every lesson that you learn in this class has been pulled out of advisory circulars, the information in there. And these are essential documents in aviation industry, but they're non-regulatory guidance materials issued by the FAA. They can be kind of a couple pages long. They can be entire books long, and they'll have an AC kind of number to them. They offer invaluable insights, and they give the best recommendations, best practices, and that's their purpose. So some topics covered would be like pilot training and certification, aircraft maintenance, airspace usage and procedures, airport design and operations, and safety management systems. So you might want to pause and write those down in your notes. Advisory circuits are assigned specific codes for easy identification. Each ACs receive Alphanumeric identifier, that means it's got both alphabets, letters, and numerics, which is numbers, that help it recognize and retrieve it. So for example, you may have an AC 6165E or AC 150 530 70-10H. Ugh, those are long letters. Not super, super helpful, but you should know that um, you can also look them up by subject too. You can look them up by subject too. I doubt my internet's still working. Let's see. Oh, it is working now. Good. Um, maybe we'll look at some of these other things that we couldn't look at earlier too. So advisory circulars, you can come here and browse by topic, right? Browse by topic. I could look up, let's say I wanted to look up weather. I could look up weather. Well, here's the ACs about weather. Maintenance of weather radar. I don't care about that. I don't care. Let's see. Well, there's a lot here. There's a lot here. Let's see. Automated weather. Oh, I want to know about AWAS. So I could look up AWAS. There it is right there. Or whatever. You could type it in there and look up all the advisory circulars for that. This, by the way, is the AIM I was going to show you earlier. It wasn't working quite right. We'll look at it in class. And this was some regulation we were looking at. My internet decided to die, and now it's back alive, so that's good. So for some examples, we'll talk about some of these examples in class. But like collision avoidance, you want to know, well, what's the best practice for avoiding collisions in the air? Well, you could read an advisory circular on that. Working at a non-tower. This is one that a lot of private pilots should read. Like, how do I work at an airport without a control tower? By the way, most airports in the United States do not have control towers, so you might want to read up on that one as well. Let's see, what else do we have here? Oh, airworthiness directives, ADs. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about maintenance in another lesson, but sometimes you have stuff that has happened, and so an airplane gets manufactured, it gets put out there in the public, they fly it for a couple of years, and they start to notice, after 1,000 hours, we should have them inspect this thing because it seems to be wearing out ahead of schedule or whatever. So they'll issue what's called an AD, an airworthiness directive. And so let's talk about a little bit about airworthiness directives here in just a second. ADs are legally enforceable regulations issued by the aviation authorities. They are regulatory. They are issued to correct existing safety conditions or prevent potential safety hazards. ADs apply to specific aircraft models, engines, and components. So you may say for the IO360 L2A Continental engine, every 150 hours you must change the oil filter or something like that. So it'll be very specific to something like that. Compliance with an AD is mandatory. So it's something you need to check before every single flight. You should check the ADs for that aircraft. At the flight schools I've worked at, they usually have a list of all the ADs right there in the binder that you get when you check out the plane. If you own your own plane, you're required to look up those ADs for that plane yourself. You'll become very good at that very quickly. I promise, because all that maintenance stuff costs money, and you'll start to manage your money, and you'll start to figure that stuff out pretty quick. Complying with airworthiness directives. Number one, compliance must be maintained and presented for inspection. So they're just kept in a logbook for the airplane, kind of like your pilot's logbook, but it's for the airplane. Aircraft operators and owners must carefully review and understand the requirements of the ADs. Operators and owners. Notice it doesn't say pilots. So I could fly a plane for a company, right? They're the owner and operator. I am the pilot. So I'm operating the plane. So I'm kind of lumped into there. But typically, I just need to really understand like what was supposed to be done and when was it done. And was it done in a timely fashion based on the AD itself. Maintenance personnel are certified. Repair facilities perform those actions. Okay, so they have to be done by a mechanic. A lot of them can't be done by a pilot. I imagine there probably are some that can be. I'm not familiar with them off the top of my head, though. Non-compliance with ADs can result in penalties, grounding of aircraft, and loss of certification. And guess what? It's also unsafe. There's a reason for that AD. It's supposed to be done. It's supposed to be completed so that the airplane, doesn't fail in flight and cause undue harm to people on the ground or harm to you and your crew. So yeah, we want to comply with those ADs, airworthiness directives. Any questions you have, please write them in your packets, and we can go over those in class. Thanks a lot.